Good evening, parents. So today your student learned that 3/10 and 30/100 were actually equivalent fractions, which then would make them equivalent decimals. So your student for homework has to go between the tenths and the hundredths and back again. So let me show you what I mean. Your student would be given something like 0.5. So they know 0.5 means that it's in the tenths place, so their numerator would be 5 and their denominator will be 10. And the directions will ask, take this and write it in the hundredths place in fraction and decimal form. So they have to take this 5/10 and make it into the hundredths place and write that as a fraction and a decimal. So we take that decimal, which is 5/10, and in order to go from the tenths place to the hundredths place, we have to bump up the value by 10. So they multiply the numerator and the denominator by 10. Remember, back when we did fractions, they were reminded if you do something to the denominator, you do the same thing to the numerator. So a lot of students like to make the bottom number 100, but then leave the numerator the 5. Make sure they're multiplying that 10 by the denominator and the numerator to make their new fraction 50/100. And then your student should be able to use the skills that they learned yesterday and know that I didn't give them a whole. So that's 0.50, because the last digit needs to end in the place that we are talking about, which is the hundredths place. Now, that's taking it from the tenths place and putting it in the hundredths place. And some students did realize all you had to do was add a 0 on the end of everything, which was pretty amazing. You will also be asked, however, to take it from the hundredths place. So they would get 0.80. And your student should know, since it's 80, it's ending in the hundredths place. So that means our denominator is 100 and our numerator is the number that's given, which is 80. And the directions will say something like, take this decimal and turn it into the tenths place in fraction and decimal form. So that means take that 80 over 100 and divide it by 10, because the opposite of multiplication is division. So when you divide by 10, it would become 8/10. Now, remember, whatever you do to the denominator, you have to do to the numerator. So if you divide that denominator to make it into the tenths place by 10, you need to divide the numerator by 10 to make 8/10. And your students should be able to think back to the lesson that they learned Monday and know that there is no whole given, so 0, and decimal 8, because the denominator tells you what place the numerator goes in. So in this case, the tenths place, and you put the digit 8. The other thing that students will see tonight making equivalent fractions is something like 3/20/100. And they're asking to break that back down into tenths place. Now, like I told the kids earlier today, don't mess with your wholes. You can just bring that on down, because if I gave you 3 whole cookies, it wouldn't matter if I cut them in half or if I crumbled them into a million little pieces. You're still getting 3 whole cookies. So we don't need to mess with that. However, this instance, I took that whole cookie and I cut it into 20 pieces. I want to reduce that and cut it into tenths. So you will use the same thing, dividing by 10 to get your new fraction of 2/10. And you just bring that on down right next to your whole. So 2 tenths is equivalent, 3 2/10 is equivalent to 3 20 hundredths. The same is true in reverse. So your student may be given 5 3/10, and they're asked to change that into a hundredths. Again, you do not mess with the whole because you're still getting 5 whole cookies. I'm just asking you to change the way that you're cutting your cookie. So instead of into 10 pieces and giving away 3, I want you to cut it into 100 pieces. So we're going to multiply the numerator and the denominator by 10 to get a new fraction of 10 times 10 is 100, and 3 times 10 is 30. So their new number would be 5 31/100. And if they happen to need to write this in a decimal, their wholes goes on the left-hand side of the decimal point, and then they should write the 30 on the right-hand side of the decimal point, with the last digit ending in the place that the denominator is telling you. So in this case, it's telling you the place value is hundredths, so the hundredths place, and the 0 needs to end in the hundredths place. Be very careful with this because some students are confusing when they make it into a 30 that I was asking for 3 100ths, and they like to put that 0 in the tens place to hold the 3 to make it into the hundredths place. So please make sure your student is aware that this is asking for a 3 to be in the hundredths place, whereas this is asking for a 30 to make it all the way to the hundredths place. Make sure they know the difference between the values that are being asked. As always, if you need me, please don't hesitate to email. Have a great evening.